neuroscience, quantum physics, biology, plant medicine, non-dual tantric meditative practices. We will be exploring these concepts with experts to provide insight. Get ready to melt reality with us.
So today we're going to look at a study that uses rigorous scientific methods to evaluate transcendent thinking. Now, Jody, transcendent thinking is something that we at Exploring Reality Maybe are fascinated with, and we consider this quite an important topic to think about. What's your view? What do you consider to be transcendent thinking?
The question of the decade, right? From my perspective, transcendent thinking involves considering a broader implication about the universe as well as ethical aspects of social situations. But it's also this study of what happens when the mind, intellect, and ego calm down and the intuitive present awareness of oneself is then expanded. This kind of study, this kind of conversation is a hallmark in the developmental stage in who we are as humans. So if you're telling me that there's a scientific investigation that actually is studying transcendent thinking, I'm all in and I'd love to know more.
So that's exactly what I'm saying. And that's why I thought this would be such a great study for us to kind of review together. So in this study by an investigator named Gottlieb and her colleagues at both UCLA and USC, the researchers embarked on a 5-year journey to understand how teenagers think about the world and themselves in the ways that go beyond what one just thinks about in, quote, the material world. So the study was entitled Diverse Adolescents, Transcendent Thinking Predicts Young Adult Psychosocial Outcomes via Brain Network Development. Now, that's a mouthful, and that's typically the way a scientific study would be, in a journal, in a scientific journal would be entitled, because the authors want to be precise in what they're doing and what they're studying. But in a nutshell, what they're doing is they're using scientific techniques to study transcendent thinking. Very, very innovative. So according to these scientists, this type of thinking isn't just about daydreaming. It's about considering the ethical and personal impacts of what happens in society.
So what did they do, David? How do you possibly study transcendent thinking in a laboratory?
So they followed 65 young people between the ages of 14 and 18 years of age to see how what they defined as transcendent thinking might influence their brain development, and eventually how it might influence their sense of happiness in relationships as young adults.
Oh, man. So what does this mean? You can't just read a person's mind? I mean, I know there's brain waves. Are you saying that they studied areas of the brains that lit up when they were thinking differently?
That's right. They used a machine called an fMRI, or a functional MRI. Many of you have had, many of our listeners, I'm sure, have had MRI imaging to sort of evaluate maybe their shoulder, maybe their knee, maybe their brain. And an MRI machine is designed to do that. This is a special kind of MRI called an fMRI, and they use it to image parts of these subjects' brains that are active under certain conditions. And they can look at differences between different people who have different sort of proclivities that they can measure in different ways. And they can determine how do different people's MRIs differ when they study them over time.
So in this case, in terms of transcendent thinking, what did they find?
So the findings were actually fascinating. So they were really trying to understand what the differences, what stood out about teenagers who engage in deep reflective thinking. Scientists come up with fancy names, and they call this type of thinking transcendent construals. So an individual who's sitting in an interview and they have this sort of thinking that we're talking about, they call it a transcendent construal. And so a teenager who had more of these transcendent construals in their interviews showed a unique pattern of brain development. So specifically, two critical areas of the brain started working together more effectively. One of these areas is involved in reflective autobiographical thinking. That's called the default mode network. And another area of the brain is called the executive control network. So what happens is the default mode network starts working in conjunction more with the executive control network in people who have more of these transcendent construals than in subjects who didn't have these transcendent construals.
So the study is suggesting that when a young person has reflective thinking or a not so intellectual, reflective, autobiographical thinking, that they engage in a different way in the brain that actually shows a difference in their brains as measured by this fMRI. Is that
Yeah,
right?
that's exactly right. So essentially, these two regions of the brain that I talked about, they harmonize, they attune to each other in a person who does more transcendent thinking. So that's a very, very interesting finding. It's a very sort of precise scientific or objective finding that probably could predict who, ultimately, if more of this research is done, you could probably predict which individuals are more likely to be engaging in this transcendent thinking.
So you said that they followed these kids for 5 years. So what happened as they followed them forward? Did they continue this kind of transcendent thinking, and what did the study show?
So interestingly, as I said, the first thing it showed is this harmonization between these two areas of the brain, and it kind of had this ripple effect where over time, these two areas seemed to work much more together than in individuals who didn't engage in transcendent thinking. But really interestingly, those individuals who engaged in transcendent thinking and whose areas of the brain started working together seem to have higher self-esteem and more satisfying relationships later in life. So this was not just an incidental finding. It really suggested that adolescents who have these proclivities for engaging in these complex perspectives and emotions, it has long-term psychological benefits, so to speak.
Wow, that is incredible. So these scientists have shown that kids who think more um, oh, out of the box or relationally or experientially have a different brain function, and that they're happier and more self-fulfilled. Is that correct?
That's right. That's a really good way of saying it. So this study is really just a window into what's happening in the brain during these transcendent moments, and it seems to predict these sort of more general well-being.
So David, what does this mean? Like, what do we do with this information if we're raising kids or if we're thinking about storytelling in the world? Like, how does this study inform us?
So I think this study is the starting point for something very, very powerful, right? I think it's about encouraging teenagers and probably even younger kids to engage deeply with these complex social and personal issues. And that engagement could be a key to helping them develop, not just intellectually, but also emotionally and socially. So the findings of this study could provide an evidence-based framework for educators and parents, telling them what kind of environments are going to be most beneficial to kids, and that inside, under the hood, right, we're seeing this harmonization of these two regions of the brain, but outwardly we're seeing happier and more emotionally connected kids. So it really does suggest some actions that we can take in the home and in the school.
So you always tell me that correlation is not causation. So what if something else about these individuals, based on their transcendent thinking, was driving their brain to work this way. I know it's hypothetical, but maybe these brain areas work together, and those who are happier in life are just the smarter kids.
It-
And it has nothing to do with their tendency to talk about transcendent topics. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great point. And you're really thinking like a scientist now, right? Because this is what scientists do. They do a study like this and then they challenge themselves, right? They say, well, we don't want to get off on a wrong track. We don't want to conclude something that's not right. So let's think about all the different explanations that could account for my findings. And just like you said, Jody, one thing that could account for these findings, it would be called, a correlational effect or a confounding effect. And like you said, IQ would be a very, very good confounding effect to consider. But the investigators looked at things like IQ, they looked at ethnicity, they looked at socioeconomic background, and they found using statistical techniques that their findings were not related to those things. Their findings were, in fact, related to the transcendent construals that they measured in these interviews with them. So, when they looked at the various possibilities, the transcendent construal statistically seemed like the most likely thing, and these other sort of obvious areas seem not to be related to these findings.
So these findings could represent a more universal phenomena, yet you sound a little cautious.
Right. So I say they could represent a more universal phenomenon. I don't say they do represent. And that's really in general good scientific thinking. It's very, very important to be critical and to be cautious and to not take a study like this and say, haha, this is the answer. They found this. We really are fascinated with this finding, and we're intrigued with this finding, and we want to believe that this finding is well established, but we have to be careful, right? This is one study. This is a very complex study using, very complex techniques. And I've provided a very, very oversimplified view of the study, right? I'm trying to take the strongest interpretation of the study. I would say many of the things that we've talked about today are really not proven. I would say there's some data to support these perspectives, but we're going to have to sort of see if it's repeatable, if other investigators can repeat it, and if this pioneering research ultimately turns out to be reproducible. But I am cautious, but I think it's a very, very interesting study. And I think it really suggests some really interesting avenues for further study, for replication, and for really interesting interpretation about how we should raise our kids and how we should educate our kids.
Amazing. And so, David, just to clarify and repeat some of the framework of what these scientists describe as transcendent experiences or transcendent thinking. What does that look like? I know there's the default mode network, which is sort of daydreaming, but what else would define a transcendent type of thinking?
Well, right. So the thinking is not about what's happening in the brain via MRI, right? The MRI is correlating with the thinking. So the transcendent thinking is found by these investigators when they sit face to face with these kids and they talk to them, right? So the way they do this study is they actually talk to these kids about their interpretation of an interview that they showed them. And it turns out that the kids who used transcendent kinds of formulations to describe their interpretation of the interview. And these are formulations that are about their emotional connection to the world. Things like, I also find it unfair that the people, that certain people get undocumented, for example. It's kind of weird how it's like a label, how just because you are from one place and one part of the world, you can't do certain things in another place. So a kid who sort of engages with the world like that in that kind of value-based, emotional kind of based system has these correlates in their brain. So that sort of gets under the hood a little bit about how they actually did the study and determine these transcendent construals.
So it's fascinating to me because obviously we have the mind intellect, we have the ego forming opinions, but what you're describing is the an emotional quality, like a personal, subjective, emotional quality of thinking that's more, what, I don't know if the word is passionate or more emotional, more moving the individual out of just the intellect. And it seems like you're saying that that has this balancing effect between the default mode network and the other part of the brain.
That's exactly right. So it's people who have that kind of emotional IQ, so to speak, right? Rather than a more traditional IQ that are having that harmonization in the brain. And
EQ,
that turn out to be happier later in life.
yeah, EQ,
EQ.
emotional intelligence versus IQ, right?
That's
The
right.
intellectual
That's right.
intelligence. Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh my God, this is just so fascinating. Well, I mean, I know we're going to put the study in our show notes, and you know, we hope to learn more about this and to interview other experts on child brain development and well-being. So, David, thank you so much for, you know, diving into this with me. It's just extraordinary.
Absolutely. And we hope to sort of address other fascinating studies like this in the future.
Now, this is cool. The music you have been listening to is actually my consciousness in motion. To create this hypnotic music, Marsha Britskaya of NextVox and her team connected musical notes to the frequency of my brainwaves from gamma to delta. The team at NextVox will be exploring how listening to your own brainwaves can provide health benefits from reducing your blood pressure to calming anxiety. Visit our show notes to learn more about NextVox.
Exploring Reality Maybe is written, produced, fact-checked, and edited by Jody R. Weiss and David Schwartz. Research support is provided by Semicolon Connects. Music produced by NextVox. Visit our website at exploringrealitymaybe.org to find show notes, transcripts, bios, and to learn more. If you like the show, please visit our website to donate.